This is K.M. Weiland, and you are listening to the 628th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Imposter syndrome for writers is a real thing, plus the key to slaying it. Imposter syndrome. It's a trending phrase these days. You see it everywhere. Just hearing the words may evoke a twinge of recognition, along with an accompanying clench of nausea in your gut. A tremendous amount of writers identify with the idea of imposter syndrome. Foundationally, this is the feeling that you aren't good enough, that whatever praise or success you may have achieved was nothing more than a stroke of luck, and that sooner or later people will find you out as a phony or at best a one-trick pony. Now, it's no wonder writers seem to be disproportionately affected by imposter syndrome. For starters, we put our most vulnerable bits on display for a living. More than that, we work in a craft that not only requires high level and often delicate skills, but also one that is often judged arbitrarily, with opinions based more on people's emotional experiences than on any set standard. If you make money from your art, even that can often fail to provide any kind of stable measure of your success. Your first book may be a bestseller, but the next one may not be. In fact, the more success a writer achieves, the more aggressive imposter syndrome can become. After all, the more people who believe in your success, the more you have to live up to. And yet, it can sometimes feel like you're the only one suffering. You look around on social media and all your peers or idols seem to be happily sailing through their careers with few or any doubts, sharing win after win. You may think, well, they seem to have it all together, so I must really be an imposter. Maybe you're just starting out and battling the belief that I could never be a writer. Or maybe you're on your dozenth book and making enough to write full-time, but constantly fighting the feeling that I'm not worthy or I'll never really be good enough. Either way, you're not alone. Now, I'm just going to say this up front. There is no quick fix for imposter syndrome. There's no snapping your fingers and declaring begone. Now, why is this? Because imposter syndrome isn't caused by external factors. It's not the result of how well you write, how many books you've sold, how many good reviews you've received, or how much money you make as a writer. Imposter syndrome lives much deeper inside, like a resident parasite. And this means banishing it requires concentrated and ongoing efforts to understand its true causes. This episode has been on my mind for quite some time. One of the reasons I want to share it is because I believe it's valuable for writers who are perceived as successful to own that they too may feel like imposters. And this is important because it highlights the fact that the feelings of imposter syndrome have nothing to do with actual metrics of success. Indeed, harking back to our discussions of the shadow in the last two episodes, working through imposter syndrome is very much about working through one's own personal shadow. So I'll just give you this one for free. Although I have been a full-time writer for over a decade, sold over 500,000 books, been published in 7 languages, won awards, blah, 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 I face down imposter syndrome every day of my life. I am scared every time I launch a book, including my most recent book, Writing Archetypal Character Arcs. Negative reviews still put me in a tailspin. Every time I publish a post or an episode, including this one, there's a voice in my head telling me what I'm saying isn't particularly smart or valuable or original, that one of these days, people are going to figure out I'm an uneducated hack who makes no sense, that the only reason I'm a successful writer at all is thanks to sheer dumb luck. Now, obviously, there are other, louder voices that keep me going. And I only share this because I want other writers, especially those who perhaps don't yet have enough outward metrics of success to help them argue against the inner critic, to know they are not alone, and that the voice of imposter syndrome is not some clarion of truth that must be heeded. And the other reason I'm sharing this episode now is because some of my own personal work with imposter syndrome recently bore some fruit that gave my thoughts enough shape for a full episode. I actually had another episode scheduled for this week, but after encountering powerful insights from two separate sources this week, I wanted to hammer out my thoughts while they were still hot. Alrighty, so let's just get to it. The reason you feel like an imposter, you are. Now, I know that reads like clickbait. I know it probably feels uncomfortable. I know it's an extreme statement, but it's probably true. We are imposters if we are pretending to be something we are not. In some instances, this may fall under the old dictum of fake it till you make it, which may inspire us to pretend we have it way more together than we do. But it may also result when we have, in fact, refused to integrate our own good qualities or successes, in which case we may be pretending, even to ourselves, that we are not as good as the facts clearly say we are. Regardless, the experience of imposter syndrome indicates a lack of cohesion between inner and outer realities. Sometimes this lack of cohesion results from our fears about claiming a true identity, whether it's one of being a noob or being an expert. However, it often points to a lack of understanding about this inner conflict between the old safe identity and the newly emerging totally scary identity. And we may not even recognize that these two competing identities are the mutual creators of our often nauseating uncertainty of how to tell which voice, the encourager or the critic, is telling us the truth. So this week, in reading Dina Metzger's Writing for Your Life, I came across her description of the imposter syndrome experienced by Marie-Louise von Franz, the renowned student of Carl Jung, who wrote such books as Shadow and Evil in Fairy Tales. In Metzger's words, Marie-Louise von Franz tells how she is attacked by the critic every time she sits down to a new work. You don't know anything, you can't write, that's stupid. That's how the critic belittles one of the most brilliant people of our time. This, says Marie-Louise von Franz, sometimes goes on for days, but she persists to our good fortune and the work appears. As I read this, I was struck by how all the world sees a woman like von Franz, how I see her as someone who gave so much to the world through her writings. From our view, on the outside looking in, the woman was certainly not an imposter. She was a woman with a brilliant mind with whom few could keep up, and yet she was an imposter to herself because some part of her insisted on believing, on pretending, that she was not this brilliant mind, that in fact her contributions were worse than useless. Often we hear this term, imposter syndrome, and think the cure must be just getting over the idea that we are an imposter. However, I think the cure is the opposite. The cure is recognizing we are imposters, but perhaps not in the ways we initially assume. Imposter syndrome is really just another name for the hell our inner critics like to put us through. Now, I have spoken before about how the inner critic can, in fact, be an ally. When we are able to cultivate a good relationship with our inner critic, it becomes an advisor able to offer us invaluable guidance. And again, this points to shadow work, because a critic whispering abuses in our ears is clearly not a helpful or integrated part of our conscious personalities. Even still, its very presence indicates that there must be some corresponding good stuff hiding out in our unconscious shadows, waiting for us to rehabilitate and reintegrate it. So what if we stopped viewing the critic as the bad guy? We can, and should, still call it out on its unacceptable behaviors, while also acknowledging that its deeper motives may be to help and protect us. Imposter syndrome is usually the sign of an identity shift. Either our identity within the world has shifted, or we seek to do something that will shift it, such as become a published writer. To adopt a new identity, even a positive one, means allowing an old identity to die. Any shift in identity can be experienced by the ego as life-threatening. Now, particularly as writers, we are recreating ourselves with every new thing we write. What if imposter syndrome is popping up just to try to keep us safe? Here's a thunderclap from Metzger. She says, the critic may have developed as a protector when we were young to help us avoid situations in which we would have been utterly powerless. Boom. And isn't that the truth? When that horrible nagging voice shows up and tells us we shouldn't do that we're only going to embarrass ourselves, that really we're not as good as we think we are, isn't it ultimately trying to steer us away from situations that seem as if they might hurt us? Now, the trick here isn't, of course, agreeing with the critic, throwing up our hands in defeat, and walking away, like Rex in Toy Story 2. Oh well, we tried. Rather, the trick is in diving into the depths of ourselves to rescue and rehabilitate the shadow protector into a truly powerful and helpful ally. So if imposter syndrome is all the result of a faulty approach to how you interact with your personal identities, then the key to slaying it is simply understanding who you really are. Now, as an Enneagram 3 myself, and therefore someone who has spent a lot of her life pondering identity, I can tell you that figuring out who you really are can often feel like looking for a needle in a needle stack. After all, it may very well seem that you are both of these identities that are competing for your attention. You are both a talented writer and a struggling nobody. You are both someone who knows what they're talking about and someone who is full of beans. You are both someone who is confident, she knows what she knows, and someone who is riddled with doubt. This is because humans aren't any one thing at any one time. Rather, we exist on a timeline. We are constantly becoming. Therefore, it can be more grounding to think less about what particular identities you inhabit and more about where you're at in the process. When it comes to any public enterprise in which success is measured by outside metrics such as sales, one of the best models I've ever encountered is one I just heard about yesterday on revolutionary business coach Simone Grace Seol's podcast, I Am Your Korean Mom, in which she outlined her model for 3 stages of growth. According to Seol, those stages are: stage number 1, creation. This is when you're writing the book, building the business, etc. Stage number 2, acclimation. And this is when you're adjusting to the new identity of success. And stage number 3, acceleration, which is when you're taking everything you've learned and going 2.0 with it. So the first 2 phases are where imposter syndrome are most likely to strike. In the creation phase, you may feel like an imposter for the simple reason that you are treading into uncharted territory. You are daring to believe you can change your identity, which freaks out the critic and makes him want to slam on the brakes. Now, the good news here is that all you have to do is keep going. Eventually, you will be someone who has completed a book, someone who has mastered the skill sets of writing, someone who knows that they know how to write a book. But then comes the acclimation phase. According to Seol, acclimation is a phase few people know about, and therefore few people know how to handle. She says, how many of you have achieved a really big goal or created something that you really wanted for a long time, only to be surprised that you feel really, really terrible? So many of us think that hitting the goal is going to be the best thing ever, but then we realize that once we do hit the ambitious goal, it starts to feel really, really scary and anxious, and we just kind of have a meltdown a lot of times. It's a real thing. The pain of acclimation is that now you've created the thing that you want to create, now that you've achieved the goal, now you have to get used to being somebody who has this as part of her reality. So as we've already seen, imposter syndrome is likely to be caused by competing identities within a person's psyche. If you can identify where you are within the process, you can gain clues to which identities are struggling to become fully integrated. Doing this requires the ability for deep introspection, radical self-honesty, and time to let the pieces of oneself digest and reassemble. This is the work that will allow imposter syndrome to cease being a painful enemy and instead become a useful tool for growing oneself throughout the journey of the writing life. So I think this is a really juicy topic. So I hope you will stop by the site at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com and chime in on this topic. Have you ever struggled with imposter syndrome as a writer, and what did it teach you? If you'd like to be part of the word player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Amazon Music, or whatever your favorite podcast platform may be. And if you'd like to do something to support helping writers become authors, it always means a ton if you're able to leave just a quick rating or review on your site of choice. Also, many thanks to those who support my work on Patreon. Your patronage helps make helping writers become authors and its many resources available to writers everywhere. If you're interested in becoming a patron, you can find out more at patreon.com/kmweiland. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.